What did you do to my gazebo? I swear this is going too far. Ma'am? You mean the structure that's literally on my property? I don't care. Pay for it or else. Karen screamed like the world had personally offended her. And right there, smoke curling from my backyard, I realized this wasn't just any HOA meltdown, it was full-blown destruction on display. Smash that like button if you love watching entitlement meet justice. Subscribe if you crave chaos done right, and grab your popcorn because the woman who burned my gazebo was about to learn that the universe has a very specific sense of irony. It all started on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low and golden over the backyard, birds chirping lazily as if nothing in the world could disturb the peace. I had just finished moving a few chairs into my gazebo, admiring the way the light played through the lattice roof, when I heard her. Karen's voice cut through the quiet like a siren, sharp and shrill, filled with anger and disbelief. She came barreling across the yard, her heels crunching over the gravel, waving her arms as if she were summoning the clouds themselves to intervene. Before I could even ask what she was yelling about, she was pointing at the gazebo, her face red with rage, and shouting about property lines, permits, and outrage that defied logic. I tried to stay calm, explaining that the gazebo was on my land, that I had the deeds and the permits in hand. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the structure as if she could see some invisible crime etched into the wood. She circled it, taking pictures from every angle, her camera clicking relentlessly, and muttering about violations no one else seemed to understand. The smell of smoke suddenly reached me, faint at first, then stronger, and I realized with a cold knot in my stomach that one of her accusations had manifested into something much worse. Flames had begun licking the corners of the gazebo's roof, small at first but hungry, spreading faster than I could react. Panic surged through the neighbors as they poured out of their houses, drawn by the commotion and the smell of burning wood. Karen stood back, shouting instructions into her phone, live streaming every moment with an intensity that made my head spin. My hands shook as I fumbled for the hose, the water barely keeping pace with the fire that consumed my weekend sanctuary. She didn't seem to care that people were screaming, that smoke was filling the air, that my hard work was disintegrating before my eyes. Every word she shouted seemed to fan the fire further. Every gesture was a proclamation of victory in her own mind. I realized then that this wasn't about rules or regulations or neighborhood standards. It was about her sense of control, and her need to dominate everything around her, even at the cost of someone else's property. And as the gazebo burned, twisting and blackening, I knew this was only the beginning of a week-long nightmare that would spiral far beyond a simple property dispute. The neighbors arrived slowly at first, drawn by the acrid smell of smoke and the faint crackle of burning wood. They emerged from their driveways and lawns, eyes wide, phones in hand, murmuring in disbelief. Some whispered to each other, unable to comprehend that a gazebo, my gazebo, could be set on fire in broad daylight by the very person who claimed to protect the community. Others stood frozen, caught between curiosity and fear, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the chaos unfold. Karen moved among them like a conductor of destruction, her camera poised as if she were capturing the premiere of a blockbuster film, narrating her version of events with a voice so loud and self-assured it seemed to drown out the smell of smoke. A few neighbors called out questions, asking if anyone was hurt, or if the fire department had been called, but Karen ignored them entirely, focused only on proving her point and chronicling the flames for her ever-growing online audience. The expressions on their faces shifted between horror, disbelief, and reluctant amusement as they realized that her sense of authority was entirely self-appointed. I could see their minds working, comparing what they knew to be reasonable against the spectacle of her performance, and many of them began snapping pictures and videos themselves, not to defend me, but to record the absurdity, the sheer audacity of a grown woman gleefully destroying someone else's property. One elderly neighbor, whose hands shook with a mixture of fear and indignation, asked how anyone could be so reckless, and another muttered that she had seen Karen intimidate others in the past, and now it had escalated into something dangerous. Children pressed against the fences, wide-eyed, while their parents tried to shield them from the smoke and the yelling, attempting to make sense of the scene. Through it all, Karen remained oblivious to their reactions, convinced that every flash of a smartphone camera and every whispered conversation was validation of her righteousness. The chaos grew as more people gathered, their murmurs turning into debates about liability, property rights, and the madness of it all, creating a chorus that underscored the surreal nature of the moment. Even as I tried to step forward, hose in hand, to control the fire, I realized that the neighbors' stunned silence and their whispered commentary were part of the story now, that this had become more than my gazebo. More than a dispute, it was a public spectacle, a community witnessing entitlement in its rawest, most destructive form, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop Karen from performing her version of justice. By the time the fire department arrived, the gazebo was already reduced to a smoldering skeleton, its beams blackened and sagging under the heat, smoke curling into the sky in lazy, sinister spirals. The firefighters jumped from their truck, hoses in hand, moving with a precision born of countless emergencies, but even they exchanged glances that conveyed the absurdity of the situation. Karen, oblivious to their arrival, continued to narrate the scene for her camera, describing my supposed negligence and painting herself as a heroic protector of the community, all while flames licked what remained of the wooden structure. The neighbors clustered behind yellow tape, some shaking their heads, others whispering that they had never seen anything like this before. I tried to explain to the firefighters that the fire had been deliberately started, that it was not an accident, and that the woman who stood there filming had crossed every conceivable line of law and reason, but they were already accustomed to responding first and questioning later. Karen waved at them, calling out instructions as if she were directing a movie set rather than facing trained professionals who were about to testify to her recklessness. Her audience online must have been ecstatic, completely unaware that every moment of her live stream was not only evidence but a public record of arson and endangerment. As the hoses hissed and water began to soak the scorched ground, I felt a strange combination of relief and frustration. Relief that the fire was being controlled before it spread to nearby trees, and frustration that I had to endure this display of entitlement, live for everyone to see. Smoke-stung eyes scanned the scene, neighbors capturing angles that might someday serve as proof, their expressions a mix of concern for the property and amusement at the sheer absurdity of Karen's performance. She continued, pointing at the ruins, arguing over fines, permits, and rules that existed only in her imagination, utterly disconnected from the reality of melted paint and splintered wood. The firefighters worked methodically, spraying down each remaining ember, while Karen lectured them about community standards, oblivious to the fact that every word, every gesture, and every screenshot of her face would be used against her in court. Watching her, I realized this was not a simple HOA dispute, not a neighborly disagreement about aesthetic preferences. This was obsession weaponized, entitlement manifested in fire and smoke, and every neighbor who watched, whether in disbelief or silent delight, bore witness to the consequences of unchecked fury turned destructive. Karen had transformed my backyard into a stage for her own narrative, and the fire department, despite their training, could only contain the flames, not the chaos she had sown. The HOA meetings leading up to the fire had always been tense, but nothing could have prepared me for the intensity of the gatherings Karen orchestrated. She arrived early every time, a whirlwind of perfectly ironed clothes and carefully measured outrage, papers clutched in one hand and a legal pad in the other, ready to lecture anyone who dared challenge her authority. Residents trickled in, folding chairs creaking under the weight of uncertainty, and whispered among themselves about her reputation for dramatic proclamations and impossible demands. Karen would stand at the front, voice loud and unwavering, detailing alleged infractions with a fervor that made it seem as though the fate of the neighborhood depended entirely on her interpretation of the rules. She spoke of property values, aesthetic consistency, and community standards as if they were immutable laws handed down from some higher authority. Those who dared ask questions were met with a glare that could freeze water and a barrage of statistics, timelines, and diagrams that only she seemed capable of deciphering. The meetings became a theater of control, with Karen choreographing every moment to reinforce her position as the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. Even when neighbors presented evidence contradicting her claims, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand, insisting that their memories or measurements were flawed, that her interpretation was the only one that mattered. People who had once nodded politely now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that her obsession went far beyond neighborhood welfare. Her focus on minutiae, from the angle of a fence post to the color of a mailbox, revealed a level of meticulousness that bordered on obsession, and it was clear that her authority was as much about the power she wielded as the rules themselves. During one particularly heated meeting, she brandished photos of a gazebo belonging to another neighbor, pointing out supposed violations in the construction and use, and explained, with a dramatic sigh, that allowing such liberties would inevitably lead to chaos. The room was silent, the collective unease palpable, as everyone processed the intensity of her conviction and the relentlessness of her campaign to control the community. Even seasoned residents, who had weathered years of HOA disputes, felt a chill as Karen's eyes swept across the room, daring anyone to challenge her. It became obvious that these meetings were not about collaboration or maintaining order. They were a performance, a demonstration of dominance, a warning that resistance would be met with scrutiny and, if necessary, retribution. Her gatherings were rehearsals for the eventual catastrophe, a preview of the recklessness that would culminate in the flames consuming my gazebo, leaving neighbors both horrified and riveted by the audacity of one woman's obsession with control. The phone call to my insurance company came in the midst of the chaos, my hands still shaking from trying to douse the smoldering remains of the gazebo while neighbors gawked from their lawns. I expected skepticism, long explanations, and the tedious process of proving that arson had occurred, but the agent on the other end laughed, a sound so unexpected it caught me off guard. She asked for details, for photographs, for names and times, and as I relayed the events, I could almost hear her smiling through the line. She assured me that Karen's actions went far beyond any ordinary dispute, that this was a criminal act, and that my documentation would support a claim without hesitation. Relief mingled with disbelief. It was surreal to hear someone validate what had felt like a nightmare, to have an official acknowledge that what I had endured was not only outrageous but illegal. I hung up and realized that the fire, the shouting, and the neighbors' wide-eyed stares were only part of the story. Every photo I had snapped, every video the neighbors had recorded, and every screenshot of Karen's live stream was evidence, a digital trail leading straight to accountability. The irony was sharp. She had performed her outrage for the world to see, unknowingly capturing proof of her own crime. I could picture the court proceedings in my mind, the judge reviewing the evidence, and the astonishment on everyone's faces as Karen's intentions were laid bare. The insurance agent reminded me to preserve everything, to keep the images intact, and to document every interaction moving forward. I realized that every detail mattered, that every whispered comment from the neighbors, every shared video, and every online reaction could strengthen the case against her. As I surveyed the charred remains of the gazebo, I understood that the fire itself was only a small portion of what would become a legal narrative, that Karen's own actions had supplied the proof needed to ensure consequences. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that her obsession with demonstrating power and control had backfired so spectacularly that she had inadvertently built her own downfall. The neighbors' initial shock was slowly transforming into curiosity and then cautious support as they began to understand the full scope of her recklessness. Conversations whispered over fences and across lawns confirmed that this was not an isolated incident, that Karen's history of intimidation and excessive enforcement had left a trail of unease throughout the neighborhood. And while the fire had destroyed the physical gazebo, the combination of documentation, neighbor testimony, and the validation from the insurance agent meant that the real structure of accountability was being built around her. Karen had burned more than just wood that day. She had ignited a chain of consequences that was only beginning to unfold, and I was ready to make sure that every piece of it would be recorded and remembered. Once the smoke had cleared and the immediate danger passed, I realized that the events of the afternoon were far from over. The first thing I did was begin gathering evidence, not because I wanted to dwell on the disaster, but because I understood that every photograph, every video, and every witness statement could become critical in holding Karen accountable. My neighbors had started taking out their phones, capturing angles I couldn't see from my vantage point. I moved carefully among them, asking for their permission to use their footage, knowing that each image of the fire, each frame showing Karen's deliberate actions, was a building block in a case that had begun long before the gazebo caught fire. I went around the property, inspecting the burned wood and photographing every charred beam, every melted nail, every blackened lattice panel. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, a bitter reminder of what had been lost, but it also reminded me that evidence existed in real time, tangible and undeniable. I cataloged each photo, noting the time, the angle, and the circumstances, careful not to overlook anything that might later prove essential. Karen, oblivious to my methodical approach, continued to narrate for her live stream audience, describing her actions in glowing terms while exposing herself to the very scrutiny she thought she could control. I realized that her obsession with documentation had created a treasure trove of material, each click of her camera and each word she shouted becoming part of the record that would ultimately be used to show intent, recklessness, and malice. The neighbors, who had been reluctant witnesses at first, began offering statements, recounting Karen's previous outbursts, her pattern of intimidation, and her reputation for escalating conflicts over trivial matters. Each story added texture to the narrative, showing that this was not a single outburst, but part of a consistent pattern of behavior that justified concern, legal scrutiny, and, eventually, restitution. As I organized the evidence, it became clear that the fire was only one element of a much larger picture, one in which Karen had made the critical mistake of performing for the world while leaving a trail that could not be erased. I felt a quiet sense of empowerment knowing that I had taken control of the situation in a way she had not anticipated, turning her obsession with exposure into a mechanism for accountability. Every photo, every video, every witness statement was another step toward justice, and as I compiled the files, I could see the outline of the case forming, a clear and unbroken chain from the first flare of anger to the charred remains of the gazebo. Karen had unknowingly armed me with everything I needed to ensure that her actions would have consequences, and the knowledge of that slowly replaced the frustration and shock with a sense of strategic purpose that would guide the days to come. The moment I realized Karen's SUV might become part of the story was both surreal and satisfying. It had always been more than a vehicle to her, a symbol of status and independence, the centerpiece of her carefully curated image of control in the neighborhood. Watching her argue, gesturing wildly as smoke from the burned gazebo rose behind her, it was clear she believed the vehicle itself represented power. She had driven it to the scene with an air of triumph, waving her camera and shouting to her live audience as if she were announcing the conquest of an empire. The irony of it all was that within days, the court would seize that very SUV to cover damages, turning her prized possession into the ultimate instrument of poetic justice. I remembered the way she had positioned herself next to the bright pink car, flashing a smug smile at everyone, unaware that each motion she made was being recorded and cataloged for legal purposes. My neighbors had captured images from every conceivable angle, documenting not only her actions but her overconfidence, which would soon make her downfall unavoidable. It was almost impossible not to admire the absurdity of the situation as the legal process began to take shape. The same woman who had spent hours live streaming her sense of moral superiority was about to face the consequences of her recklessness, and her beloved SUV would become a tangible reminder of how entitlement meets accountability. I thought about how much she had relied on appearances, how much energy she had poured into controlling perception, only to discover that the law operates on facts rather than theatrics. Every document, every photo, every witness statement would converge on the same conclusion. The vehicle was no longer hers to wield as a symbol of power, but rather a tool to repay the costs of destruction she had caused. In that moment, I felt a quiet sense of vindication, knowing that her obsession with image had blinded her to the reality of consequences. The SUV, once a shiny extension of her ego, would now bear witness to her failure, and every neighbor who had watched her antics unfold could see that even symbols of dominance are not immune to accountability. It was a lesson written in steel and paint, one that would be visible for years to come, reminding anyone with a sense of entitlement that actions have consequences, and that the arrogance of control often carries a price far greater than imagined. The thought of Karen pedaling her way to work, the SUV gone, was almost as satisfying as seeing the gazebo reduced to ashes, a vivid illustration of how obsession and entitlement can unravel in the most public and undeniable ways. As the days unfolded, witnesses began stepping forward, their accounts adding layers of clarity to the chaos Karen had created. Neighbors who had once stayed silent, intimidated by her constant surveillance and unyielding attitude, now spoke freely, recounting not only the events of the gazebo fire, but also her history of escalating harassment. Each story revealed a pattern that had been invisible until someone took the time to notice, a chain of intimidation and petty cruelty that Karen had perfected over years of obsession with control. One neighbor explained how she had been summoned repeatedly to meetings for trivial infractions, how Karen would scrutinize even the most mundane details and then threaten fines or legal action if her standards were not met. Another spoke of the time Karen had cornered a family for planting flowers she deemed inappropriate, documenting the incident with a camera in the same meticulous way she had approached the gazebo. As they shared their experiences, it became apparent that this was not an isolated incident born of a single lapse in judgment, but a carefully cultivated persona designed to dominate the community and assert power over anyone who disagreed. I listened to their accounts and realized that each detail could serve as evidence in a court of law, that the witnesses themselves were key to establishing the pattern of recklessness that had led to the fire. Their words painted a picture of a woman so consumed by her sense of authority that she failed to see the boundaries between enforcement and criminality, between personal obsession and public responsibility. Even as I documented the statements, taking careful notes and cross-referencing times and locations, I could see the shift in the neighborhood's perception. What had once been fear or wary compliance was turning into recognition and, for some, quiet relief that someone had finally taken a stand. The neighbors' willingness to speak out gave weight to the evidence we had collected, showing that the gazebo fire was the culmination of a long pattern of abuse rather than a spontaneous act. It was empowering to realize that the truth was now visible from multiple perspectives, that the witnesses' voices could no longer be ignored, and that Karen's narrative of righteousness was unraveling under the weight of collective testimony. The fire, which had seemed like a private catastrophe, had become a public reckoning, and with each neighbor who came forward, the certainty grew that her actions would have consequences not only for the gazebo but for the legacy of control and intimidation she had tried to maintain. The community's stories became a chorus, each one echoing the same truth. Entitlement without accountability is always exposed eventually, and witnesses, long silent, were finally speaking the reality of what had happened. The courtroom was nothing like I expected. The building smelled of polished wood and old paper, a faint echo of footsteps bouncing off the marble floors. I had imagined tension, of course, but nothing prepared me for the surreal mix of anticipation and disbelief that hung in the air. Karen arrived, dressed in her usual meticulous fashion, her face a mask of indignation and confidence, as if she were stepping onto a stage she had rehearsed countless times. Her live streaming equipment was conspicuously absent, perhaps because the court would not tolerate her theatrics, but the intensity in her eyes betrayed the same sense of righteous entitlement that had driven her actions from the first moment the gazebo caught fire. As the judge called the case, the room fell silent. The only sound, the rustle of papers and the faint hum of the air conditioning. The lawyers presented their arguments with precision, weaving together photographs, witness statements, and a timeline that left no room for doubt. Every image of Karen at the scene, every frame of the live stream she had so carefully curated, became evidence of recklessness, intent, and disregard for the law. I watched her reactions closely, noticing how her confidence wavered as the weight of the documentation pressed against the narrative she had built around herself. Neighbors testified, recounting her history of intimidation and petty enforcement with clarity and conviction, their voices steady, almost defiant in the face of someone who had once dominated community meetings with threats and theatrics. Each story, each detail, reinforced the reality that the fire was not an isolated lapse of judgment, but the culmination of long-standing patterns of obsessive control. When the financial and legal consequences were outlined, including the seizure of her SUV to cover damages, I could see the flicker of disbelief and panic in her eyes. The courtroom became a theater of justice, the evidence constructing a narrative more powerful than any argument she could make. Her attempts to rationalize her actions as community service or moral oversight fell flat against the clear record of destruction and intent. It was a moment of vindication watching the culmination of meticulous documentation, witness statements, and photographic evidence dismantle her performance of control. The judge's final words resonated through the room, confirming that entitlement had its limits, and that every action, no matter how theatrical or self-justified, had consequences. Karen's persona of dominance had crumbled, leaving only the reality of accountability and the certainty that the damage she caused, both physical and emotional, would be addressed fully by the legal system. In that room, with every testimony and every photo displayed, the absurdity of her hubris became undeniable. Once the courtroom drama began circulating online, the storm of social media erupted in ways I could never have anticipated. Clips of the gazebo fire, Karen's fiery tirade, and the bewildered neighbors capturing every moment spread like wildfire, shared from feed to feed, comment to comment. The reactions ranged from disbelief to outright amusement, with viewers dissecting her every gesture, her every word, and the absurdity of the scene she had created. It was astonishing to watch the combination of chaos, entitlement, and public humiliation unfold for tens of thousands of strangers at the same time. Every comment highlighted her missteps and her hubris, turning her carefully curated performance into a viral lesson in arrogance and consequence. Friends and strangers alike began posting side-by-side comparisons of her live-streamed claims and the verified evidence, showing the fire, the charred remains, and her endless documentation, each image underscoring her lack of awareness of reality. People marveled at how she had broadcast her own wrongdoing, not realizing that every post, every photo, and every video would only strengthen the case against her. I noticed patterns forming in the comments, with viewers connecting dots from previous neighborhood incidents, online posts, and snippets from her own social media, painting a picture of someone who had consistently allowed obsession and self-righteousness to dictate actions that affected everyone around her. The audience's reaction was both entertaining and instructive. The scale of public scrutiny meant that Karen's narrative could no longer dominate, that her version of events would be dissected, corrected, and laughed at in equal measure. Even strangers who had no personal stake in the situation became witnesses, analysts, and commentators, providing an unparalleled form of accountability that went far beyond the local neighborhood or the courtroom. The intensity of the attention she received was matched only by the irony of it, as each viewer witnessed the same entitlement and ego that had led her to destroy property being dismantled in real time. I watched as discussions spilled over into forums, news sites, and video platforms, with people tracing the legal documents, analyzing witness statements, and scrutinizing her online posts, all while she remained unaware that the very evidence she had created was now the instrument of her downfall. The fire that had consumed my gazebo became a symbol not only of her recklessness but also of the extraordinary reach of modern accountability, where neighbors, technology, and the public eye converged to ensure that acts of entitlement could not escape scrutiny. Watching the narrative unfold online, I realized that Karen's reputation would never recover, and that the story of her meltdown had become a cautionary tale far beyond the confines of our little neighborhood. After the court ordered her SUV seized to cover the costs of the destroyed gazebo, Karen's life shifted almost overnight. The car had been her constant companion, the symbol of status and mobility that reinforced her dominance in the neighborhood. Watching her pedal furiously to work the next morning was a striking image, the pink paint gleaming faintly in the early sunlight while she strained against the pedals, a mixture of stubborn pride and disbelief etched on her face. Neighbors who had once avoided her now stopped to stare, their expressions a blend of curiosity, amusement, and relief. Karen had built her identity around control, authority, and the appearance of power, and now she was reduced to something both humble and ironic. Each pedal stroke seemed to highlight the contrast between her perceived influence and the reality that consequences had caught up with her. I could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her jaw tightened as she navigated the familiar streets she had once dominated, now entirely dependent on her own physical effort to reach her destination. Her live-streaming audience, previously enthralled by her sense of self-importance, watched in shock and disbelief as the narrative shifted. The same woman who had once narrated destruction with confidence was now struggling against gravity and her own indignation, a stark lesson in humility broadcast to thousands who had witnessed her antics from the beginning. For the neighbors, it was a quiet vindication, a daily reminder that entitlement has limits and that arrogance can be humbled in the most public and symbolic ways. I watched from my porch as she passed, the sound of her bicycle tires on the asphalt and the occasional squeal from worn brakes punctuating the morning air, each sound echoing the shift in power that had taken place. The ordeal had been exhausting, the legal process, the documentation, and the collection of witness statements, but this moment, simple and human in its rhythm, was a tangible illustration of accountability. Karen's struggle against the pedals, her determined yet futile posture, became a symbol of the price of obsession and the inevitability of consequences. Every neighbor who observed it carried with them a quiet sense of satisfaction, a recognition that justice sometimes arrives not through fire or courtrooms alone, but through the subtle, unrelenting reality of life, reshaping itself around the choices people make. Her bicycle ride was more than a commute. It was a living testament to the collapse of a self-created empire and a daily lesson that control, when wielded recklessly, can be stripped away as suddenly and dramatically as a fire consuming a gazebo. In that moment, the neighborhood seemed to breathe collectively, knowing that actions have consequences and that entitlement, no matter how loudly proclaimed, can be tempered by reality. It was only later that I realized how much my own background had shaped the way I handled everything with Karen. Years of working as a forensic accountant had taught me to notice the smallest inconsistencies, to follow the paper trail with patience, and to recognize patterns where others might see chaos. When I first discovered the fire, I felt the initial shock, the disbelief, and the anger. But beneath that, a methodical part of my mind began to catalog everything. Receipts, permits, photographs, witness statements, and even the comments from her live stream formed an invisible web of accountability. I traced the ownership of her SUV, the timeline of her online posts, and the history of her petty neighborhood disputes, realizing that every interaction, every grievance, and every escalation was part of a longer pattern of behavior that had been building for years. My ability to interpret and organize this information gave me a sense of control amid the chaos, a way to transform outrage into evidence and frustration into a legal narrative. It became clear that Karen's obsession with documentation and public performance had left a trail that was impossible to ignore. She had invested so much in creating the image of authority that she had unwittingly provided every piece of the puzzle necessary to prove her recklessness. As I compiled the records, organizing files by date, location, and relevance, the picture became undeniable. Every photograph of her at my property, every video of her live stream, every text and email pointing to her meticulous monitoring of the neighborhood was now part of a dossier that could not be disputed. I realized that my professional skills had given me an advantage that went beyond simply proving ownership or documenting damages. I could interpret the patterns, understand her motivations, and anticipate her next moves in a way that made her efforts to intimidate irrelevant. It was as if her obsession with control had created a blueprint for her own undoing, and I was the only person with the insight to read it completely. The evidence I had gathered not only substantiated my claim to restitution, but also revealed the extent of her fixation on dominance and the lengths she would go to enforce her imagined authority. Each file and photograph was a reminder that meticulousness can work in favor of justice when paired with knowledge and patience. While the neighbors had captured their own documentation, it was my ability to synthesize the chaos into a coherent, actionable record that transformed a destructive act into a path toward accountability, proving that preparation, expertise, and focus can turn even the most absurd acts of entitlement into clear evidence for legal resolution. As the days passed, the reactions of the neighbors became increasingly fascinating. What had begun as a mixture of shock and concern gradually shifted into curiosity and even amusement as people processed the scale of Karen's meltdown. The fire had left a visible scar on the backyard, charred beams and blackened debris that reminded everyone of the intensity of her obsession. From their porches and driveways, neighbors exchanged glances and whispered to one another, sharing pieces of what they had witnessed and what they had remembered from years of interactions with her. There was an unspoken recognition that the events unfolding were extraordinary, a spectacle that no one could have imagined when they moved into this quiet, suburban street. Conversations turned to past grievances, small injustices, and petty disputes that now seemed part of a larger pattern. People recalled the times Karen had questioned flower beds, fence colors, or the precise angle of driveway parking, and they began to see these incidents not as isolated quibbles but as part of a carefully orchestrated attempt to assert control over everyone around her. Children leaned over fences to watch as adults spoke in hushed tones, their curiosity piqued by the combination of drama and destruction, while older residents nodded knowingly, connecting the dots between the latest fire and long-standing tensions. Some neighbors even laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that comes from the relief of realizing that the unpredictable and intimidating figure who had loomed over them was now facing consequences that were both public and undeniable. I noticed how this collective awareness seemed to shift the balance in the neighborhood. Karen's aura of authority had always relied on fear, on the assumption that people would comply rather than challenge her. Now, in the aftermath of the fire, that fear was replaced with cautious empowerment. Residents began documenting their own experiences, sharing stories and photographs, contributing to a communal narrative that painted her not as a defender of neighborhood standards but as a person consumed by obsession and entitlement. Each conversation reinforced the idea that what she had done was not acceptable, that her attempts to dominate others were no longer going unnoticed, and that her carefully constructed persona had cracks through which reality could seep. The community's reactions became a silent chorus of validation, a reminder that when entitlement and obsession collide, the collective perspective of witnesses can shift the story from one of intimidation to one of accountability. For the first time in years, the neighbors were talking openly, acknowledging that the chaos she had created was not only destructive but also preventable, and in doing so, they became part of the evidence that would ultimately define her legacy. The insurance adjuster arrived the following morning, stepping carefully over the scorched remains of the gazebo, clipboard in hand, an expression a mixture of professional detachment and restrained disbelief. As we walked the perimeter, pointing out the most damaged areas and explaining the sequence of events, it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary property claim. The agent listened attentively as I described Karen's actions, noting the deliberate nature of the fire and the context of her previous threats and disruptions. She examined photographs, videos, and witness statements, occasionally raising an eyebrow as she cross-referenced timestamps and social media posts. Each piece of documentation reinforced the conclusion that the fire had been intentional, and every time I mentioned the live stream, the agent's attention sharpened, recognizing the unusual opportunity it provided to substantiate the claim with undeniable evidence. The neighbors, who had contributed their own footage, watched from a safe distance, some nodding in quiet approval, as they realized that their recordings were now playing a critical role in the official investigation. It was surreal to hear the agent remark that Karen's own obsession with documenting her actions had created a comprehensive record of her wrongdoing. The very things she had hoped would bolster her image now served to confirm liability and support restitution. As we moved from one corner of the charred structure to another, discussing the extent of repairs and replacement costs, I felt a strange combination of relief and vindication. Relief that the fire would be acknowledged for what it truly was, and that the process of recovery could begin, and vindication in knowing that the meticulous collection of evidence had transformed my initial frustration and helplessness into a structured, actionable case. The adjuster noted the emotional toll, the stress and disruption caused by the incident, and explained how the policy accounted for both material damage and the broader impact on my quality of life. Every word she spoke reinforced the understanding that Karen's recklessness had consequences far beyond the physical destruction, that her actions had triggered a chain of accountability that extended into legal and financial realms. As the inspection concluded, it became evident that the insurance company would support full restitution, relying on the detailed evidence gathered by myself, neighbors, and even Karen herself through her live stream. The clarity of this outcome was empowering, a reminder that preparation, documentation, and patience could turn a moment of chaos into a narrative of accountability. Standing among the blackened beams and listening to the agent summarize her findings, I understood that the fire, while destructive, had also illuminated the truth, transforming a private act of entitlement into a public demonstration of responsibility and the inevitability of consequences. Once the footage and images of Karen's meltdown reached the internet, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media lit up with clips of the fire, the scorched remains of the gazebo, and her dramatic gesturing, shared from feed to feed as people struggled to believe what they were seeing. Comments flooded in from strangers who had no connection to the neighborhood, yet felt invested in the spectacle of entitlement meeting consequence. Some expressed disbelief that a grown adult could act with such reckless disregard for property and safety, while others laughed at the absurdity of her frantic, live-streamed narrative. The story took on a life of its own as viewers began piecing together the timeline of events, comparing her live stream with neighbor accounts and photographs to form a complete picture of her recklessness. The scale of public scrutiny was staggering, tens of thousands of people now watching a drama that had begun as a private conflict in my backyard. It was remarkable to see how quickly the narrative shifted from her perspective to an undeniable account of deliberate destruction. She had believed that her camera and confident voice gave her authority, that documenting the fire would prove her righteousness and galvanize her online following. Instead, each click of her camera, each shouted explanation, became proof of intent, creating a record that could not be refuted. People began to comment not only on the fire itself but on her pattern of behavior, noting previous incidents of intimidation, petty disputes, and obsession with enforcing imagined rules. Her online audience, which she had assumed would support her, began to question her credibility, pointing out inconsistencies and sharing their own evidence of her manipulative tendencies. The internet had become a court of public opinion, evaluating every detail, every word, and every gesture, amplifying the consequences of her actions far beyond what she could have imagined. I watched as hashtags and discussion threads connected the dots, turning a local act of destruction into a viral lesson about accountability and entitlement. Each comment, every share, every replay of the footage reinforced the reality that what she thought would bolster her status was instead undermining it, that her obsession with appearance had created a record of failure. Even those who had never set foot on the street were now part of the process, their collective attention serving as a form of oversight and judgment that amplified the consequences of her reckless behavior. The story of the gazebo, once a private dispute, had become a cautionary tale, showing the power of documentation, witness testimony, and the relentless reach of the internet in holding entitlement accountable. One neighbor, who had always been quietly observant, became an unexpected hero in the aftermath of the fire. They had installed a hidden camera on their property months earlier, never imagining it would capture something as extraordinary as Karen deliberately setting my gazebo ablaze. The footage was precise, showing every moment from the approach to the ignition, her gestures, and even the way she laughed and narrated for her live stream audience. When I first watched it, a knot of disbelief twisted in my stomach, but as the seconds ticked by, a sense of relief began to replace the shock. This was undeniable evidence, captured without my intervention, that left no room for argument or denial. The neighbor had remained discreet all along, documenting minor disturbances and disputes over the years, and now their foresight had provided the most critical piece of proof in a case that was quickly escalating into something larger than any single property dispute. The clarity of the footage was striking. It showed Karen's intent and the deliberate nature of her actions in a way that even her own live-streamed coverage could not. While she had attempted to frame the event as a righteous act of enforcement, the hidden camera revealed the recklessness, the choices, and the disregard for safety that defined the incident. I realized then how valuable such documentation could be, that sometimes vigilance and preparation can turn ordinary observation into powerful evidence. As I spoke with the neighbor, they explained that they had always trusted their instincts, capturing things that seemed unusual, knowing that patterns often revealed themselves over time. Their meticulous approach had saved weeks of speculation and had transformed anecdotal accounts into visual proof that could stand in court. Each frame of the footage reinforced what I already suspected, that Karen's obsession with control had blinded her to consequences, that her actions were not only destructive but deliberate, and that the law would now see her as the instigator rather than a victim of circumstance. Sharing the footage with my legal team felt like handing over a key to unlock the truth, turning a chaotic scene into a coherent narrative of accountability. The neighbors who had witnessed parts of the fire watched alongside me, their murmurs of approval and disbelief mixing with a quiet sense of vindication. Karen had created a spectacle to assert her dominance, yet it was her own obsession with control that had delivered the evidence that would prove her recklessness. This hidden camera became more than a tool. It became a symbol of foresight, patience, and the unexpected ways in which justice can be documented long before it is served. As I began reviewing the neighborhood's collection of emails and messages, it became painfully clear that Karen's actions were not spontaneous. She had a long history of obsession with rules, boundaries, and perceived slights that extended far beyond the gazebo incident. The emails revealed a pattern of harassment, each one carefully worded, sent to intimidate neighbors and escalate conflicts over the smallest disagreements. Messages about flower beds, fence heights, and minor renovations showed a relentless attention to detail, with Karen citing regulations that existed only in her imagination. Reading through them, I could see the strategy she had developed over the years, a methodical campaign to assert dominance and control, to ensure that every resident remained aware of her authority. Each document was a window into her mindset, showing not just annoyance but an obsession with maintaining a particular version of the neighborhood that aligned with her own ideals. The correspondence included photos of minor infractions, notes about conversations, and lists of grievances that had been cataloged with obsessive precision. I realized that these emails were more than background noise. They were evidence of a long-standing pattern that culminated in the destruction of the gazebo. As I pieced the information together, the scope of her behavior became undeniable. Karen's need for control was so ingrained that she treated every disagreement as a personal affront, every minor violation as an opportunity to assert her authority. It was as if the fire had been inevitable, a dramatic escalation of habits she had cultivated for years. Even more revealing were the responses from other neighbors, who had quietly complied with her demands out of fear or exhaustion, validating her sense of power without realizing that they were contributing to the record of her obsession. The documentation painted a portrait of a person who believed that rules were absolute when she dictated them, and who was willing to take extreme measures to enforce those rules, even at the expense of property and personal safety. As I organized the emails, cross-referencing them with timestamps, photos, and witness statements, a clearer picture emerged of how deliberate her actions had been. The gazebo fire was no isolated act of rage. It was the logical outcome of a long trajectory of entitlement and manipulation. Every email, every threat, every documented complaint now formed a chain of accountability that connected years of obsessive behavior to the moment when flames consumed my property. It became undeniable that Karen's obsession had built toward this destructive crescendo, and that the evidence was now irrefutable, a record of her escalation and the consequences she had earned. The courtroom became a stage where every shred of evidence came together, where Karen's carefully constructed persona met the weight of accountability. I walked in, carrying files, photographs, and organized notes, feeling a quiet satisfaction as the judge called the case to order. Karen arrived with a semblance of composure, though there was a flicker of unease in her eyes that betrayed her confidence had been shaken by the accumulation of proof against her. As the attorneys presented their arguments, it became clear that the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs from neighbors, hidden camera footage, and timestamps from her own live streams showed a consistent and deliberate pattern of behavior that led to the destruction of my gazebo. Witnesses spoke with clarity and conviction, recounting previous incidents of intimidation and harassment, demonstrating that this was not a single act born of a sudden fit of anger, but a continuation of a long-standing pattern. Each piece of testimony reinforced the narrative, revealing Karen's obsession with control, her willingness to escalate conflicts, and her disregard for the safety and property of others. The judge examined every document, every image, and every video carefully, occasionally raising an eyebrow at the sheer audacity displayed on screen. Karen tried to justify her actions, claiming she was enforcing community standards, attempting to frame herself as a protector rather than a perpetrator. Her words, however, rang hollow in the presence of meticulous evidence that contradicted every statement she made. The seizure of her SUV was discussed, highlighting not only the financial consequences of her actions, but also the symbolic reality that the tools of her power could be turned against her. As the proceedings continued, I observed the subtle shifts in body language among the spectators and participants. Neighbors who had previously been intimidated or silent now nodded in quiet validation, their expressions reflecting relief and recognition that justice was being served. The courtroom atmosphere was charged with tension, but also with a sense of inevitability. Karen's meticulous documentation, her obsession with appearances and control, had ultimately provided the evidence necessary to hold her accountable. As the judge prepared to deliver the ruling, it was evident that this was more than restitution for property damage. It was a reaffirmation that entitlement has limits, that obsession can be countered with preparation and documentation, and that the consequences of reckless behavior extend beyond immediate destruction. Watching the process unfold, I felt a mixture of vindication and relief, knowing that every action Karen had taken, every dramatic gesture and irrational claim, had led to a resolution grounded in truth and accountability. The case was no longer just about a gazebo. It was a testament to the power of evidence, community, and persistence in confronting entitlement and obsession. Even after the courtroom proceedings, Karen's attempts to control the narrative continued online, though the impact had shifted dramatically. Her social media posts were filled with frantic explanations, justifications, and elaborate attempts to cast herself as the victim, but the audience no longer responded with awe or support. Instead, the comments were filled with incredulity and critique, people pointing out inconsistencies between her posts and the verified evidence that had been presented in court. Every video clip, every image, and every screenshot of her meltdown became a point of comparison, illustrating the gap between her perception and reality. Her followers, who had once celebrated her authority and confidence, began questioning her motives and integrity, dissecting every detail of the fire and the subsequent legal consequences. It was astonishing to witness how quickly her digital empire, built on charisma and self-assured performance, began to unravel under the weight of collective scrutiny. I watched as the comments highlighted not just the absurdity of her behavior, but also the recklessness of broadcasting it live, creating a permanent record that could not be erased or misrepresented. Strangers from across the country, and even internationally, began contributing to the conversation, sharing links, analyzing timestamps, and corroborating elements of the story with the documentation made available online. The sheer reach of the internet amplified the consequences of her actions far beyond the local neighborhood, turning a private dispute into a public spectacle of accountability. Even as she posted in defense of herself, the narrative had shifted irreversibly. People began to connect the dots between her previous incidents of intimidation, harassment, and obsession, forming a pattern that reinforced the evidence presented in court. Her attempts to manipulate perception failed because the combined force of video, photographs, witness statements, and public attention created an unassailable record. Each new post she made only further highlighted her inability to grasp the reality of her situation, the audience noting the disconnect between her claims and the documented events. Watching the digital conversation unfold, I realized that the consequences of entitlement were no longer confined to fines, restitution, or court rulings. They had entered the public consciousness in a way that was enduring and undeniable. The story of the Gazebo fire, once a localized conflict, had transformed into a viral example of how obsession and recklessness are exposed and judged by both the law and the broader community. Karen's attempts to control her image were rendered irrelevant, and her social media presence became a record of accountability rather than power, illustrating that even online, the truth has a way of prevailing. The neighbor who had been quietly documenting Karen's antics stepped forward in a way that changed the entire dynamic of the case. They had captured photographs, videos, and subtle details of behavior that most people would have dismissed as eccentric, but which now revealed a clear and disturbing pattern. As they shared their collection, it became evident how meticulously Karen had orchestrated her intimidation, how carefully she had chosen moments to assert control, and how consistent her obsession had been over time. Each image they presented showed not only her actions during the Gazebo incident but also previous instances of surveillance, confrontation, and harassment, revealing a continuum of behavior that had gone unchallenged for far too long. Watching the evidence unfold, I was struck by how her obsession with control had become her own undoing. Every camera angle, every captured expression, every carefully staged gesture was now part of a record that demonstrated intent, recklessness, and a disregard for the law. The photos themselves told stories that words alone could not convey, showing her pride, her triumph, and her willingness to act without regard for consequences. Neighbors who had been intimidated or passive observers now spoke with confidence, confirming the events depicted and adding context that reinforced the narrative of harassment and obsession. It was a surreal experience, seeing the quiet vigilance of one person turn into a decisive contribution to justice, a reminder that documentation and foresight can transform perception into irrefutable proof. The clarity of the evidence left little room for argument. Karen's claims of moral duty or community protection were stripped bare by the visual record, which revealed a pattern driven by personal obsession rather than public responsibility. Each photograph became a touchstone in the legal narrative, connecting isolated incidents to a larger trajectory of behavior that ultimately led to the fire and the destruction of my property. As the images were compiled and shared with my legal team, the scope of her obsession became undeniable. They illustrated a relentless focus on perceived violations, a meticulous chronicling of my life and property, and an eagerness to broadcast her version of events for validation and authority. The neighbor's quiet dedication had transformed into the strongest piece of evidence, providing not only confirmation of the immediate crime, but also context for years of escalation. Karen had created her own downfall through her obsession, and now the photographs, taken by someone who understood the significance of careful observation, ensured that the truth would prevail. Every frame was a reminder that vigilance, patience, and attention to detail can turn chaos into accountability, and that even the most confident displays of entitlement can be documented and held to account. The financial consequences of Karen's actions became undeniable as the legal process progressed. The destruction of the Gazebo was not merely a personal affront, it was a tangible, calculable loss that demanded restitution. As the court reviewed repair estimates, invoices, and the value of materials, it became clear that her recklessness carried a price far beyond the immediate embarrassment of losing face. Karen's SUV had already been seized to cover a portion of the damages, a symbolic and practical measure that highlighted the seriousness of her behavior. Every dollar of restitution was calculated not just from the physical damage but also from the disruption and stress she had caused. Watching the figures laid out in the courtroom was a strange combination of vindication and surreal disbelief. It was one thing to know that she had destroyed property, but to see the financial impact quantified and made official was entirely different. Each line item, each cost of replacement, reflected months of work, savings, and careful planning that had gone up in flames through her obsession with control. The documentation gathered by neighbors, combined with my own records, made it impossible for her to dispute the damages. The court acknowledged not only the tangible costs but also the broader implications of her behavior, considering the emotional toll, the stress imposed on witnesses, and the disruption to the neighborhood. Karen's attempts to argue for mitigation or to claim some form of justification fell flat against the clear evidence of intent and recklessness. The room, once tense with uncertainty, gradually shifted as the scope of restitution became clear. For the first time, her authority and intimidation were powerless against the structured, undeniable reality of the financial assessment. The neighbors, who had contributed their own documentation, nodded quietly as the sums were presented, recognizing that the justice being served was both fair and inevitable. It was a rare moment in which personal, legal, and communal accountability converged, a reminder that consequences extend beyond moral judgment into the practical realities of life. Watching the court finalize orders for restitution, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that every piece of evidence, every photograph, every witness statement, and every neighbor account contributed to ensuring that Karen would bear the cost of her actions. The financial impact was more than repayment. It was a tangible, lasting reminder that entitlement has limits, that obsession carries consequences, and that careful documentation, persistence, and patience can transform chaos into accountability. Karen's actions, once a source of fear and frustration, had now created a clear path to justice that extended far beyond the physical destruction she had caused. The community itself began to reflect on what had happened in ways that were both surprising and gratifying. The fire had left a visible scar in my backyard, but it had also left a lasting impression on the neighborhood, forcing everyone to confront the consequences of unchecked entitlement. Conversations on front porches, over fences, and during morning walks gradually shifted from quiet speculation to thoughtful discussion. Neighbors shared their own experiences with Karen, recounting times when her obsession with rules and control had intruded into their daily lives. Stories about unnecessary fines, threats of complaints, and over-the-top scrutiny of minor details surfaced, and for the first time, people began to see the pattern for what it was. There was a collective realization that her behavior was not merely eccentric or overzealous, but part of a sustained effort to dominate and intimidate those around her. As people spoke, they acknowledged the impact of fear and compliance in maintaining her power. It became evident that many had remained silent for years, not wanting to challenge her or risk becoming targets themselves. The fire and its aftermath broke that silence, creating a shared understanding that her actions could no longer go unexamined. Neighbors began to document their experiences, to provide their own evidence and statements, contributing to a broader picture of accountability. The tone of these conversations was a mix of relief, vindication, and empowerment. What had once felt like a community overshadowed by fear now felt alive with awareness and agency. People were learning that vigilance and collective memory could act as a form of protection against future attempts to impose control unjustly. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Karen's reign of intimidation had left visible scars, but it had also created a neighborhood more aware of the limits of entitlement and the importance of standing up to unreasonable behavior. Children watched their parents engage in these discussions, learning lessons about fairness, accountability, and the power of evidence and collective witness. The community began to reorganize socially, with neighbors checking in on one another, sharing resources, and confirming that the small, seemingly insignificant details of daily life mattered in establishing boundaries. In this way, the fire had become more than destruction. It had become a catalyst for cohesion, awareness, and resilience. People understood that the consequences of unchecked obsession reach far beyond a single act of vandalism, and that the strength of a neighborhood lies not in the authority of one individual, but in the shared commitment of its residents to fairness, vigilance, and accountability. As the dust settled, the neighborhood began to absorb the lessons that the fire had taught in the most dramatic way possible. Everyone had witnessed the consequences of unchecked entitlement and the dangers of obsession left unchecked, and slowly, those lessons took root in conversations, behavior, and attitudes. People began to reflect on the power dynamics that had existed for years, realizing how Karen had relied on fear, intimidation, and the illusion of authority to maintain control. The fire, the legal consequences, and the viral exposure of her actions all served as a wake-up call, showing that no individual, no matter how loud or persistent, could act with impunity. Neighbors began talking openly, sharing stories that had previously been whispered or hidden, comparing notes on previous interactions, and piecing together the pattern that had led to the destruction of the gazebo. Each account reinforced the understanding that entitlement has a natural limit and that communities are strengthened when people hold one another accountable. The conversation was not just about the incident itself, but about the larger implications for trust, respect, and boundaries within a neighborhood. People began to consider their own responsibility, realizing that passive observation or reluctant compliance had allowed a pattern of abuse to persist for far too long. The dialogue shifted from gossip to practical discussion, focusing on how to prevent similar incidents in the future and how to support one another in standing up against unreasonable behavior. It became clear that the power of community lies not in the authority of a single individual but in collective awareness and action. Residents who had once felt powerless discovered a sense of agency in speaking openly, documenting their experiences, and participating in the conversation about fairness and accountability. The fire had been destructive, but it had also sparked a new consciousness, a shared understanding of how entitlement can affect everyone and how vigilance and cooperation can counteract it. Children watched their parents engage in these discussions, learning lessons about fairness, consequences, and the importance of standing up when something is wrong. The neighborhood slowly began to reorganize socially and psychologically, reinforcing bonds that had been strained by fear and uncertainty. In this way, the chaos of the fire became a catalyst for growth, a reminder that even the most disruptive acts can lead to a stronger, more resilient community. Karen's actions had inadvertently taught everyone that entitlement carries consequences, that obsession can be exposed, and that the collective strength of neighbors is a force more powerful than any individual's desire for control. Watching Karen adapt to her new reality was a lesson in humility and the inevitability of consequences. The loss of her SUV had stripped away the symbols of power she had used to assert authority over the neighborhood, and every day she pedaled to work on a bicycle, a stark reminder of how drastically her life had changed. The sight of her negotiating traffic, struggling with the pedals, and navigating streets she once ruled from behind tinted glass was a mixture of irony and quiet satisfaction. Neighbors who had once feared her presence now observed her with a mix of amusement and incredulity, seeing the contrast between the persona she had projected and the physical reality she now faced. Each morning, as she rode past the same homes she had once monitored and controlled, I felt the subtle shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. The tension and apprehension that had permeated every conversation, every meeting, and every encounter with Karen slowly dissolved, replaced by the collective recognition that her entitlement had limits and that the community could enforce them. Her daily commute became a living symbol of accountability, a demonstration that no matter how carefully one constructs a facade of power, actions have consequences that cannot be ignored. The sight of her straining against the pedals, her expression a mix of determination and frustration, provided a silent, ongoing lesson for everyone who witnessed it. It was a reminder that power is not defined by status symbols, by vehicles, or by theatrics, but by responsibility, accountability, and respect for others. For the neighbors, it was not just entertainment, it was a tangible illustration of the outcomes of obsession and arrogance. Her adaptation to this new reality, her struggle to navigate life without the conveniences she had once taken for granted, underscored the broader lesson that entitlement carries costs, often far greater than imagined. I realized that her daily journey was a continuation of the consequences that began with the gazebo fire, a slow but undeniable process of understanding that dominance and control are fragile when weighed against evidence, law, and community awareness. Every pedal stroke was a reminder that what was once hers to wield as a tool of intimidation now demanded effort, persistence, and humility. The contrast between her former authority and her present struggle reinforced the neighborhood's collective awareness, demonstrating that even the most determined attempts to control others can be tempered by reality, and that the consequences of reckless entitlement can reshape a life in ways that are both immediate and enduring. Even months later, the story of Karen and the gazebo continued to circulate, reminding everyone of the consequences of unchecked entitlement. Clips of the fire, images of the charred structure, and her frantic, live-streamed reactions had become a staple in neighborhood conversation and online forums, a cautionary tale repeated for anyone who might think that audacity can replace accountability. People would point out the dramatic irony of her pedaling to work, Once proud and untouchable in her SUV, now reduced to effort and humility, and they would laugh quietly or shake their heads at the relentless pursuit of control that had led to such a spectacular downfall. The footage and photographs, compiled carefully from neighbors, hidden cameras, and her own documentation, had become permanent records, showing a consistent pattern of obsession, harassment, and escalation that extended far beyond a single act of destruction. Even strangers, drawn in by viral shares and posts, could trace the narrative from the early warnings and minor disputes to the blaze itself, understanding in clear terms how entitlement, when unchecked, escalates into recklessness. The neighborhood had transformed in response to this story, creating a culture of awareness, mutual accountability, and the understanding that vigilance matters. Residents now shared their experiences openly, discussing the boundaries of acceptable behavior and the importance of documenting interactions, ensuring that no one else could repeat the mistakes of the past without consequences. The fire had become more than destruction. It had become a catalyst for education, for community cohesion, and for a shared understanding that authority is not a birthright but a responsibility, and that claiming power over others without accountability has repercussions. Karen's downfall was not only legal but symbolic, serving as a visible reminder of the fragility of self-assured dominance when confronted by evidence, persistence, and collective observation. The story continued to ripple through the neighborhood, a living lesson for anyone who witnessed it or learned about it online, a cautionary tale repeated in conversations, posts, and casual gatherings. Her former aura of power had been replaced by a narrative of accountability, showing that obsession and entitlement, no matter how loud or dramatic, are subject to limits. Even as life returned to normal in small ways, the tale of the gazebo endured as a vivid example of the consequences of ignoring those limits. Karen's legacy had been transformed from a figure of intimidation into a case study in humility, demonstrating that recklessness and entitlement leave traces that endure far longer than a single act of destruction, and that the community, armed with evidence and awareness, is always capable of shaping the outcome. And there you have it, proof that when entitlement meets justice, the results are explosive, viral, and unforgettable. Karen burned my gazebo, lost her SUV, and became the neighborhood spectacle overnight. Meanwhile, the community, the internet, and even the courts reminded her that actions have consequences. Hit subscribe if you want more tales of outrageous neighbors meeting their match, and drop a comment with your own Karen meltdown stories. Remember, audacity is free, but karma always charges. Until next time, may your neighbors be sane and your gazebos safe.